Welcome back, Year 10. It's lessons 10 and onwards when we're talking about living in Nazi Germany. We left the story in the middle of Nazi control. How were they able to maintain control for 12 long years? And there was a triangle of that. We're still in chapter 2. We haven't moved on yet. This is the next part of chapter 2. You might have noticed that chapter 1 was a bit short. Don't worry, that's okay. It is. So chapter 2 is a little bit longer and a little bit more complex. The triangle had 3 points. It had support, it had propaganda, the real goose, and then it had terror, pant-wetting fear. And we've done the bottom row. I'm now going to talk about the super secret fourth bit inside the triangle, the weakness of the opposition. And to explain that, I need to talk a little bit more about support. But before I go any further, I have to do the bad YouTube thing where I look at the screen to find out what I'm doing. And I show you an unfamiliar view. Look, it's Ecclesbourne. So, Ecclesbourne School. I've got some questions for you. And if you're playing this right, what will happen is I'll ask you to pause the video. You will pause the video and then have a go at the questions. Come back, and when you think you've got some answers, I will feed them back to you. Now, there's no compunction at this stage to write anything down. It's a thought process. Ideally, find someone who needs punishing. I mean, a partner, a friend, a family member, and check with them. But yeah, someone over Skype or Zoom will do, or Discord, or whatever your text chat of choice is. But here we go. Start your task. I know, it's like being in a classroom. The school discipline system. Let's talk about this. 2 questions for you. 1, does it work? 2, how? If you're playing properly, you'll pause the video. I'm going to assume you've paused and then restarted and had to think about your answers. Does it work? Well, there are multiple answers to this. And you might have said, well, yeah, absolutely it does, sir. And it works because we know it works, because I've never broken any rules. Good on you. Or you might be sitting there going, well, I wander around the school with my top button undone all the time. And I like lines, and I don't do them unless I'm Miss Wibbly, and then I have to do them because she forces me and I hate it. But that's fine. That's fine. I know how you feel. But you're both right. It does work for what it sets out to do. To get the working, you have to know what the aims are. On the face of it, sure, uniform is appalling. People arrive late to lessons. You go to the toilet 5 times a day between lessons, as well as lunch and break time, which I find weird. I hope you don't like that at home. Well, I suppose if you are, it doesn't really make that much difference because it's just a toilet trip away. You maybe need to go now. But the point is, how does it work? There are lines, because we're living in a Harry Potter fan fiction, and that's about it. Occasionally it gets shouted at by me, which I'm told is a scary experience, but I'm me, so I can't find that terribly terrifying. Mind you, I've seen pictures of me and I've watched a couple of videos of myself, and I am so sorry. So anyway, you could have come up with those things. I haven't really answered the question, you might have noticed. Okay, 2 more questions for you. 3rd, where does it fail? And 4th, why? Have a pause. Okay, you might have said where it fails is uniform. You kind of hinted at that, sir. Well, thank you, rhetorical device. I totally did, because people don't wear the uniform properly. Or you might have said it fails when we go on the fire drill, where people are supposed to line up all straight, but they don't. Where people are supposed to line up in silence, but they don't. Sorry, form. If you're watching this and you're in my form, you know full well that I cannot help myself but start singing fire-related songs under my breath as I do the register, because at heart, I too subvert things. If any senior members of staff are watching this, I totally don't do that. It's a joke. So, where does it fail? It fails on the small stuff. Why does it fail? Well, we can't control you all the time. We don't have any major threats we can level at you. Our biggest threat is expulsion. That's it. Leave the school. And to be fair, if you don't like what you see, that's hardly a threat. It's kind of a promise. So, yeah, you could argue the school discipline system utterly fails. Except that, what if I told you it didn't? What if I told you it did exactly what it needed to do? And that is keep people quiet. Allow me to explain. If you have undone your top button and you get away with it and no one gets you for it, you feel like you've won something. You feel like you've done something. You feel pretty brave. You untuck your shirt. You walk past, you swagger past upper school office, and no one picks you up on your uniform. Someone then mentions it and you get so, oh, well, I walked past upper school office and they didn't care. You feel like you've won. You feel like you've done something huge. And because you're doing that, and that is pretty dangerous, then you're not putting a potato up someone's exhaust pipe. You're not hurling a brick through Mr. McNamara's window. You're not setting light to the science department with a carefully arrayed set of history worksheets in a corner. And because you're not doing these things, we're winning. And so you see how the terror state in Nazi Germany actually worked. It wasn't there to iron out all opposition. It wasn't supposed to catch everybody. It couldn't. There was one Gestapo member for every 22,000 Germans. How could it possibly do this? Rather, it was there to keep people quiet. And when you combine it with propaganda and the belief that you would get destroyed for doing little mini things like, I don't know, insulting Hitler and saying that Mussolini has more sense in one of his boots than Hitler has in his brain, oh, it's the appearance of the thing. Remember when we said about Nazi ideology, and I kept banging on about image over substance? That is how the Nazis keep control. All well and good, you may say. But you haven't really explained that, sir. You told us about the terror state and made it sound terrifying. Judge Roland Freiser, the Geheimstaatspolizei, the concentration camps, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS. These are terrifying, legitimately. And in propaganda, you told us how it had a certain effect on people. You are correct. So what I need to do is explain how the Nazis actually used it. So, back to the thing. Oh, helps if I make it work. The question we're actually going to study over these next couple of lessons, the title in your books for the notes, is Who Dared to Oppose the Nazis? And in the background here, I should probably remove my face. In the background here, you've got a series of people, the youth, a Nazi youth group. You've got the Hitlerjugend. You may recognize the uniforms. When the title moves in a moment, you'll see what I mean. So there you go. Look, there they are with a guitar. You can't do anything without a guitar. And by the end of these sessions, there's more than one lesson actually. It says by the end of this lesson, but it'll be more than one video. I'm hoping that all of you will be able to list and offer details of groups that dared to oppose the Nazi state and how they did it. I'm hoping that most of you will be able to identify different opposition groups and explain how opponents tried to oppose the Nazis, effective or not. Some of you will go a stage further, be able to use what you know to support information and source material effectively, and thus improve your consistency. And that should say in paper 3, and I apologize, I have missed that point. It should say paper 3. So those are the 3 areas I'm looking at. So that's the aims of what I'm trying to do here. You're familiar with the almost sum. All of you will be able to do it by the end, of course. The next thing to do is to remind ourselves what it was the Nazis were aiming to do. It is not enough for people to be more or less reconciled to our regime, to be persuaded to adopt a neutral attitude towards us. Rather, we want to work on people until they have capitulated to us, until they grasp ideologically that what is happening in Germany today not only must be accepted, but also can be accepted. Remember Joseph Goebbels' quote, it's 100% of the people, 100% on side, 100% of the time. It is an impossible goal. Nobody, but nobody, can achieve this. Obviously, therefore, there were some opponents. And that's where we're going to start. Now, I apologize. The first thing I'm going to do is get you to write some notes. And what I have here is some, turn my video off, is some attempt to get down in your notes, in your books, whatever you're taking the notes on, some form of basic background, because one thing I haven't covered, and I'm aware I haven't covered it, is support. So what's about to happen is note-taking as opposed to an activity. Be prepared. You can pause the show if you like, because it's a video. You can do what you like. I'll still be here when you've finished. So, in introduction, let's talk about resistance. Let's talk about opposition. What do we mean when we say opposition? Well, we'll talk about it more in a moment. But the thing I want to draw your attention to is the word resistance. Is it enough for people to simply say, I don't like the Nazis? Is that going to be opposition? Or are we going to mean a little bit more than that? And the difficulty is that the Nazi view of resistance, given they wanted 100% of people, 100% on time, 100% of the time, I mean on side, what they viewed as opposition, what they view as resistance is trivial. It's tiny. It's irrelevant. What's irrelevant? It's grating with a trunk. It's pointless. Generally speaking, therefore, anyone that opposed the Nazis were not effective. The stuff they did was dangerous, brave, carried a death sentence, but it wasn't going to bring the Nazis down. A bit like what happens in schools. You undo your top button, you undo your shirt, you swagger a bit, you talk back. These are safe options. At the end of the day, you are not going to be that negatively affected by the consequences of your actions, provided you still carry out revision and whatnot. But it's not effective. It's not going to change the school. No one's going to listen to what you have to say. We'll just ignore you. And the Nazis could afford to do the same. The other thing to bear in mind is the Nazis are in power from 1933 to 1945. Nobody stops them. So right from the off, we know that opposition is useless, but incredibly brave because of the terror state and propaganda. The debate isn't how effective was opposition. Opposition was not effective. If it turns up as an essay question, it's an absolute golden opportunity for you to go, well, there's no debate here. Here are the reasons it's rubbish. There is no debate about the effectiveness of opposition. The debate is who resisted the Nazis, who was brave enough. And that's where it gets interesting. As historians, we're absolutely mad keen on evidence. We're mad keen on proving anything we say. We don't like sort of saying, well, oh, you know what I mean? We refer to evidence, we refer to sources, and that's what we're training you to do. And paper 3 is all about that, or rather, the living in Nazi Germany section is a bit like the section on paper 1, where you've been doing the Elizabethans. We're mad keen on source material. But on that one, it's, okay, what can you learn from it? How does it work? On this one, it's like, okay, next level up, how do we use it as historians? The problem with the evidence is that people are anxious to prove that they opposed the Nazis. After the Nazis fall, when everyone knows what they did, people are interviewed, well, what did you do in Nazi Germany? And of course, everyone says, well, I didn't support the Nazis. I wasn't a Nazi. Don't talk rot. But that doesn't answer the question, does it? We can't just take them at their word. They're very anxious to prove that they had nothing to do with Nazism. Allow me, if I can, to, hold on, do that, and talk to you about something called the third wave in California in 1960s America. This professor at university decided to set up an experiment. It might not have been California, come to think of it. Do look it up though. And he said to his class, they said, well, it couldn't possibly be that German people didn't oppose the Holocaust. They must have known, and if they knew, they should have stopped it. What that proves, they said, was that German people are not like American people, that Americans would never do anything like this. American exceptionalism, the idea that Americans are somehow freedom-loving and would never do as they were told by a dictatorial regime. Well, Professor, okay. And he believed them, by the way. He actually agreed with them and wanted to prove the point. So the next lesson, he decided to set it up. He did a fascist-style lesson, and he drilled them on how to sit, on how to breathe. He spent most of the lesson talking about breathing exercises. He then finished off the lesson talking about how to give an answer. So he had to stand up to give an answer, and the answer had to be as short as possible. It didn't matter whether it was right or wrong. It just had to be short. The shorter the answer, the more credit they gained. Ditto with written communication. And they had to wear their shirts properly and smartly. And he did that for a lesson. They did it. They were big. They left. Everyone was a bit confused, and he assumed they'd come into the next lesson and essentially kick off. But they didn't. They came into the lesson. They sat properly. They breathed properly. And when he asked a question, they stood up to give an answer and then sat back down. They liked it. So he decided to see how far he could push it, and he kept pushing it. So they wore blue shirts. They were smart. They he said, all right, credit is now not how good you are at my subject, it's how short your answers are and whether or not you can tell me if anyone else is being rude across campus. If they're interrupting their professor, let me know. And your credit is based on that. So tell me, report on one another. And to his amazement, they did. And one guy started following him around, the one that was really, really bad at the course, started following him around and protecting him and preventing other people from getting in his way when he was relaxing or at the photocopier or the Daisy Wheel printer. It's for you, Mr. Beardsley. And that stopped people doing things, and it spread. And he began to realise that people were turning up to his lesson that he'd never seen before. Soon there wasn't space in the room, and he realised it was getting out of hand. So he decided to put a stop to it. Now, there are a couple of students who were really worried about it, and they'd gone to see him in private, and he'd explained that it was an experiment. And they were saying, look, it's getting out of hand. We need to do something. So I've got an idea. So what he did was he put about that there was a nationwide movement, that what they were seeing here, they called it the third wave. It's based on surfer speak. That's why I think it's California. The third wave being higher and more powerful than the rest. I don't really understand it. I'm not a surfer. And he put out that there was a national movement called the third wave, and they were going to take over the country, and that anybody interested should turn up to a major hall and be addressed by their national leader. Well, word was everywhere. When the time came, there was a hall set up, all darkened, with a projector, ready to have this national address. There was standing room only. Packed. The projector began. And of course, it's a speech by Hitler. And then an explanation of how Hitler leads to the Holocaust, and then a brief bit of documentary about how the Holocaust, well, what it was. By the end of this, when the lights went up, there were 3 people left in the room apart from the professor. The 2 students who'd warned him, who were sort of looking around going, well, it seems to have worked. And the guy that had been following him around who was in tears because he believed it. Many years later, the professor bumped into that guy, the fellow that was crying at the end, and he reminded him of the experiment and how much it had affected his life going forwards. And the professor thought, well, I wonder how much of an effect it had with other people. So he put out a contact thing for anyone that remembered, and sure enough, the 2 students got back to him and reminded him of all the intricacies of it and how they'd been fearing for their lives at one point. But everyone else that got back to him said they remembered that there was something called the third wave, but they'd never been a part of it. In fact, no one apart from his original class would own up to being part of the experiment. Nobody had been in that hall that day. That hall, with standing room only, had no one in it. And the professor realized something. It was exactly the same as what people saw, historians saw, when studying the Third Reich. After the fall of the Nazis, nobody was a Nazi. Nobody had taken part. But of course they must have done. And so you begin to see the first problem with the evidence that historians have to work with. It's human. The second thing is the Nazis kept detailed figures of who opposed them and what they did, but then they burned them at the end of the war. So they're incomplete. There's a lack of figures. We simply don't know. The Gestapo, SD, and party reports are paranoid. They thought everybody was about to have a revolution against them. Anything, graffiti scrawled on the wall down with the Nazis. Oh, it's going to be a revolution. There's a nationwide movement against us, because they are totally paranoid. They overemphasize how big, how powerful, and how effective the opposition were. Which makes sense. Remember, they want 100% of people, 100% of the time, 100% on side. So any deviation from that, they were terrified of. So you can't even listen to the Nazis. Weirdly, the Nazis think they faced more opposition than they actually did. So paid. Do we take them at their word? Well, they were taken in, remember. They were the Socialist Party in exile from the last lesson, on terror, I think it was. No, on propaganda, the whisper message. Well, they're taken in. A lot of what they say says that the Nazis face less opposition than they actually do. They go the other way. The Nazis overemphasize the opposition, so paid say there's less of it than there is. So it's really hard. Finally, there are dissenters' diaries, people that didn't like the Nazis that kept secret diaries. Trouble is, a lot of these diaries were written after the fact. Remember, everyone's anxious to prove they weren't a Nazi. And if you do keep a journal or any kind of secret book where you write your thoughts, it's probably on Instagram these days, then you know full well that you cultivate and you curate what you want to be made public. So some things don't get talked about, other things do. So dissenters' diaries have their own issues. So what am I trying to say? Apart from broad brushstrokes of the level you need for this course, there's not a lot we can do. When you come back to this in year 13, we'll go into more detail on this, but it's really hard to work out who opposed the Nazis, how much and how many. Furthermore, there's the problem of support. Now, I've talked a lot about support, but I've not actually given you any details. Here are the details. The consensus of all historians who study the Nazis, and that's a lot of historians. There are more words written about Hitler, more books written about Hitler than there are seconds in a human lifespan. I'm not joking. So this is a massive topic. But the consensus, the overall view of historians, is that there was a climate of support in Germany. Generally speaking, people were okay with the Nazis. And that is an awful thing to say. Not because they're German. Not because, oh, the Germans are used to being told what to do. Or the Nazis were particularly good. It's just how we are. Indeed, Hitler was viewed positively, even if the Nazis weren't, right up until the Second World War. And during it. It wasn't until the end of the war, where things started to go a bit south, where things started to go wrong, that view changed. It is a fact that there were no significant protests against the Nazis at any point. No one did it. Furthermore, by 1933, the Nazis enjoyed a range of support, from businessmen right the way through to women and everything in between. You might remember that from that slide on how the Nazis, how Hitler became Chancellor, how he was appointed Chancellor. Propaganda and control of the media gave the Nazis control of the message, and in many ways allowed them to maintain that atmosphere, that climate of support. Also, there was economic and foreign success. Haven't talked about these, but in brief, there's the Nazi economic miracle. We will come back to that later in the course. The Nazis also defied the Versailles Treaty. Remember, that really had Germans upset. They felt humiliated by it. The Treaty of Versailles was just mean. How did they defy it? Well, in 1935, there was a Luftwaffe. An air force announced they were specifically forbidden from having one. No one bothered. They announced conscription, that is, making sure that all soldiers or all people of a certain age became soldiers, as long as they were male, of course. And again, they're only supposed to have an army 100,000 soldiers large. This was a direct breaking of the Versailles Treaty, but they're allowed. It was fine. After all, it's their country. Poland had a bigger army than them, and the Polish people had elected their government, who had become a dictatorship, who then wanted to invade Germany and openly talked about that. So maybe Germany should protect themselves. People weren't that bothered about it. In 1936, Hitler ordered his troops to march into the Rhineland. Now, it was still part of Germany, but it had been demilitarized because it was on the border with France. So the army marched in and nobody stopped them. But this was enormously popular. Can you understand why German people looked to Hitler and said, okay, he might be a bit weird, but look what he's delivering for us. This is amazing. What more could we possibly ask for? In 1938, there were two successes. First of all, he unified with Austria. Austria called it an invasion, but the Nazis called it an Anschluss, a unification, specifically forbidden by that very word in the Versailles Treaty. Austria and Germany became one country. It's the part of the background of the plot to The Hills Are Alive with the Sound of Music, The Sound of Music. There you go. Fun fact about that film, at the end, they go over the wrong mountain. They're actually heading to Bavaria. So presumably they get arrested and executed. And also he invades Czechoslovakia and gets away with it. No one stops them. And then in 1939, the Nazis invade Poland and gain Danzig, which is an old German city, back from Poland. Remember those people that said they were going to invade them 4 years earlier? That's why they needed conscription. Yeah, well, they've invaded them first. You can see why this makes them incredibly popular. And after each success, the Nazis ask, do you agree with us? And they have this voting paper that's got a massive circle for yeah, and a teeny tiny one for 9. And yeah, sure enough, they get like 98% support rate. Well, of course they do. This is popular. Now, if you don't like the Nazis, what are you going to do? They've got 98% support ratings. Are you going to be the first to go out there and form a protest, wave a placard on your own? Of course not. You won't do it with student fees to go to university that will directly affect you because others might not join you. They might be too lazy. And then you're the one that's going to get done for it. The embarrassment will be too strong. And we don't even execute protesters. In Nazi Germany, and you're beginning to see, support generally is huge. People, they grumble, but they're okay with it. There's also the difficulties of resistance themselves. What difficulties did you face if you wanted to go against the Nazis? Well, first of all, people assumed the Nazis would fall. They were a joke. They were rubbish. They were chaotic. They were stupid. They couldn't possibly run their own affairs. More about this in year 13. The Nazis are a strange bunch. Hitler himself is seen as a joke. People openly laugh about it. The anti-Nazi jokes. Did I say the anti-Nazi jokes? The first of these is, what's the perfect Aryan? Ah, it's blonde, like Hitler. Tall, like Goebbels. And fit, like Goering. Don't worry, that will make more sense later. Or the other one, why do Gestapo agents go around in threes? One of them can read, one of them can write, and the other one is there to keep an eye on the two intellectuals. Do you see my point? They're not funny. The point is, people assume they're idiots. They can't possibly succeed. They'll trip over their own feet sooner or later. They don't know what they're doing. They regularly make mistakes. They go on national television to defend their chief advisor. No, wait, sorry. And furthermore, the Nazis were very good at the job. They remove potential opponents. They get them into those concentration camps very early on. There's no one there to coordinate or organize opposition. That atmosphere of support, that atmosphere of what we call consent, is people assume that others are okay with it. And if they're okay with it, then better keep my mouth shut. Everyone else is all right with it. And then I say the Berlin Cafe source. Observe. I remember being in a big Berlin cafe when Hitler was announced to speak over the microphone. The loudspeaker was turned on. Next to me was a group of German businessmen. They went on talking in low voices. At another table was a woman writing a letter. She went on writing. The only man who stood up was a little fellow with his tie creeping over his collar at the back of his head. No one in the crowded cafe listened to Adolf Hitler. Philip Gibbs is a journalist, and he seems to suggest what? Pause the video, have a think. What's he trying to say? What's the point of this source? Pause. I'm going to assume you paused the video and had to think about this. On the face of it, Philip Gibbs seems to be telling us that only idiots supported the Nazis. How do we know? It's a man with a tie creeping over his collar. Imagine. And the tie creeping over the collar. It looks stupid. This does not seem like a clever man. He stands up to listen, and everyone else just ignores it. On the face of it, he says that the propaganda doesn't work, the terror state doesn't work, and no one is supporting Hitler. But I'm using it to support the difficulties of resistance. How can I possibly achieve this? Read again. Pause the video, have another look. Pause. Okay, you've had another read. Does anybody interrupt the broadcast? Does anybody shout Hitler down? Does anybody disturb anybody else listening to it? No. The businessmen carry on talking, but in low voices. They keep their voices down so others can hear. The woman writes a letter. She carries on writing her letter. She doesn't say anything. Not a single person says, turn it off. And in the cafe owner is perfectly happy to play it. That suggests that everybody here is already part of support. They're part of consent. They're okay with it. The journalist has missed the mood of the room. I mean, on the face of it, sure. But you've kind of missed the point here. No one goes against the Nazis. And this is in 1934. This is before the Nazis really get their terror state going. This is before the propaganda really has chance to bite. People are okay with it. Huh. When you add in the threat of the terrorist state, who's going to dare oppose the Nazis? Then you've got the problem that the opposition groups themselves don't like one another. Let's talk about those, shall we? First and foremost, there's the left wing, the lefties, the nutters, the communists, the KPD, the SPD, SOPAID, Comintern from Russia, the Rote Kapelle, and then the workers. And sure enough, there's some strike action. Some people go on strike. And fair enough, they do bargain. They try to get better wages. They try to get opt-outs, so they don't have to do Nazi meetings. They don't have to wear Nazi uniforms, or they don't have to fulfill Nazi contracts. But is this really resistance? Are they trying to bring down the state? No, it's not. It's sort of dragging your feet. It's working slowly in a lesson. It's not hurling a spitball at the teacher. It's sort of, oh, I don't get it. Oh, why can't you go and help me? I can't do the work if you don't help me. And I know, and you know, that these are delaying tactics. Well, I'm asking questions, but you're not giving me the answers I want. You've used that. You've all used that. There's John Hartfield. Jan Herzfeld was his name, but he said if being German is to be a Nazi, then I'm not a German. Changes his name to an English name and goes to live in Czechoslovakia. But that went well when Czechoslovakia got invaded. Does it do anything? No, it's incredibly brave what he does. He should be respected for it. But it didn't change anything. So we're left with the question, the left effective? Now, there's religious opposition. Churches and Nazism. Nazism wanted an end to the Christian church. They hated the Christian church. Its messages of forgiveness and turning the other cheek. Nazis hated that. Don't turn the other cheek. Stab them in the face. Forgive people. No, hate them forever. They hate the churches. So the churches do what they have to do to survive. Otherwise, they'll be eradicated. And mostly, they do as they're told. They pray to the German God. They pray for German victory, a return to German traditional values. I mean, there's a bloke called Niemöller who sets up the confessional church for anyone of any stripe in religion who, believes in God and doesn't like the Nazis. They can go to the confessional church and pray against the Nazis. And you might say, oh, sir, that's just ridiculous. But keep in mind, a lot of people are religious. This is a big move. Niemöller ends up in a concentration camp. He ends up dead. Bonhoeffer, another one of the confessional church, is executed. This is a big deal. Does it do anything? No. The Protestant church, generally speaking, falls into line with the Nazis and actually quite likes it. Gets rid of gay people. The Catholic church, well, the Pope makes a deal with the Nazis. They won't talk on political matters, and the Nazis will leave them alone. One church opponent, a bloke called Bishop Galen, actually makes anti-Semitic remarks fairly regularly and never, ever speaks out against the Holocaust. Yeah. Are the churches effective? No, they're not. Then there's conservatives. Those people who like tradition, those people who were in charge of the army at the beginning of all this. People like von Papen, the army. Von Stauffenberg, a general, tries to blow Hitler up in 1944 and fails. And then he's hung with piano wire. The civil service, they get really upset with the Nazis because the Nazis refuse to fill any records in, certainly not in triplicate. But they do it anyway. 1939, a bit of a turning point. The army sort of throws its lot in with Hitler and become bound to him. Slowly but surely they get angry. I mean, 1944, they do try and blow him up. They are the ones that tell the most anti-Nazi jokes. But that's it. Von Papen becomes foreign minister to Czechoslovakia. That went well. And that's it. Not really very effective. Then there's the youth, the people, the youngsters, the ones the Nazis care about the most. More about that later. The Hitler Jugend, well, it's growing disillusionment. I won't go into details. We'll talk about the youth later. The turning point is going to war. Again, I'll explain later. There are youth opposition movements. Notice how I haven't mentioned very many for the other groups, but for the youth, they exist. There's something called the Edelweiss Pirates, Edelweiss after the Austrian symbol of independence. They basically are the Hitlerjugend, but without uniforms. There's the Swing Youth. They listen to jazz and grow their hair long. There's the White Rose movement. That's about 6 people, one of whom is Sophie Scholl, who gets executed. Tremendously brave, tremendously powerful. But effective? No. So what can we say? There's not a lot of opposition, and that which does exist increases after 1939. The trouble is, each of these groups down the bottom here hate each other a lot, and arguably most of the time end up beating one another up rather than turning against the Nazis. The Nazis are less bad than the Conservatives to, I don't know, the youth. The left wing finds religion far more dangerous than the Nazis. So they won't work together and actively, well, they use the Nazis to beat one another up. They dog people in. They're as bad as everybody else. What conclusions can we draw? And this is where I'll pause this particular lesson. First of all, size of resistance. It's tiny. There's more in the Second World War, sure, but it's tiny throughout. The effects of resistance? Well, the Nazis get more paranoid, the terror state gets more powerful, propaganda kicks into overdrive. But it didn't really stop the Nazis. The significance of it? Huge. That anybody tried, given all of the stuff that I've told you about today so far, is amazing. Absolutely amazing. Incredibly brave. Just doesn't do anything. So what do you need to know? For an exam, you will need to know specific examples. Don't worry, I'll give you more. And you're going to need to know your different types. If an essay question ever turns up on opposition, it's going to be on how effective it was, or did it do any good? The question really is, who resisted though? Because the answer is they are not effective and they don't do a great deal of good. They're very brave, they're very exciting, but they don't do a lot of good. And it might explain how the Nazis are able to keep control. If you want a third factor in an essay to go with propaganda and terror, you might say, well, I could do support, but I prefer to do how the opposition was rubbish and beat each other up rather than beating the Nazis up. So there you go. That's the purpose of this. Hopefully, therefore, this has been useful to you and you've been able to follow it. By now, of course, the lesson has kind of been getting long. So I'm going to pause here. I'm going to start a new video. And if you have been, thank you for watching. Do let me know if it's working in the show homework comments. And yeah, have a lovely day, Year 10. Who knows? We may be seeing each other in face-to-face soon. I'll be more terrified than you. Stay safe, Year 10. And I'll see you on the flippity-floppity later on.